Hey, welcome back. Today we're working on this 143 cubic inch Milwaukee 8 motor. I didn't have a way to install the rear piston in the bike, so it's out. And while I have it out on the bike, I'm just going to assemble the whole motor right here. You already saw me do the lifters, the cam plate. One thing I didn't like was the slop in this gear. So that affects timing, and I want this to be precise as possible. So fueling makes a replacement that it's pretty much press on, but it has zero slop. So we're gonna go ahead and install that. Also got a new cam chain and a S&S tensioner. First step is to get the timing chain installed with both timing gears, making sure to line up the timing marks. Then we lock both cam gears together with this Jim's locking tool. Torque both bolts to 15 foot-pounds, back them off one full turn, then the pinion shaft gets 24 foot-pounds and the cam gets 34 foot-pounds. Next we're going to install our brand new S&S cam chain tensioner. These bolts get torqued to 10 foot-pounds. Make sure to add blue Loctite to the fasteners. Now since we got a bunch of new parts, I'm going to add some assembly lube to the chain, the sprocket, and the shoe, all these rotating parts. And then I'm going to spin the motor around using the rods just to spread that lube around. Cam cover goes on with a brand new gasket, blue Loctite on the bolts, and they get torqued to 10 foot-pounds in sequence. Now the fun part, we got these massive 4.5-inch cylinders that we're going to lube up with engine oil. In this case it's 2050 conventional Lucas oil that we're using here. For the cylinders and rings, I like to use whatever engine oil that we're going to break in the motor with. Here I'm lubing up the 4.5-inch ring compressor, automotive style. And then we're going to push the piston into the cylinder with the ring compressor using a little bit of persuasion with a dead blow hammer, just the handle of it. Just as gently as possible. Man, that's a big piston. Push it down through the bottom of the cylinder and tap it the rest of the way through, being very, very careful not to expose the rings. So we just want to have the piston pin bore exposed just enough to get the pin in. A little bit of assembly lube on the bore and on the pin. And on the small end of the rod. We'll double check and make sure our base gasket's on. And then we'll try to manhandle this big assembly onto the rod. Now we have to push the pin through the small end of the rod, which is easier said than done to get it all lined up. The tolerances are pretty tight on those two components. But I managed to get the pin through the bore. Now we just got to rest the cylinder on the studs while we get some rags in the spigot holes here for the case. We don't want the piston pin clip to fall into the case. That'd be really bad. Now we take our piston pin clip and install it into the groove. Use a little pick to help you get it installed properly, and then double check and make sure that it's actually in the groove all the way. And then I'll verify the other side to make sure the other side of the piston has the pin in it as well. So, and then oil up the bottom of the skirt a little bit here. And then remove the rags and send this cylinder home. Just carefully rock it until it goes into the spigot. Everything's tight tolerances, so just be careful. And then we go ahead to the rear, lube up the cylinder. And the piston. and then assembly lube on the pin bores and on the small end of the rods. Same thing as the front. We take our automotive style ring compressor, tapered ring compressor, push the piston in, and send it home with a rubber mallet. Here's an example of why it's important to double check everything. I have this piston in like 90 degrees out from where it should be. There's dots for the thrust surface, which is facing the cam, and then the arrow that faces forward on these pistons. And they have to be lined up the correct way for clearance issues. And the same thing, tap the piston through, exposing the piston pin bore, assembly lube on the piston pin, big end of the rod, or excuse me, the small end of the rod. Get the cylinder over the rod, and get that pin through the small end. I edited out about a minute of me trying to do that. And then double check everything's good, and we're good. Same thing, put some rags in the spigot hole, and get the piston pin clip on. Double check and make sure it's in the groove completely, and then double check and make sure that the rear or the other side is in as well. Can't forget those. And we're good. Remove the rags and send this cylinder home. If you notice, on the front cylinder I have some old piston pins and the head bolts just lightly bolted down to keep the cylinder down when I do this. I don't want it moving around. And we're in. Now one of our final measurements is to check piston to valve clearance. And as you can see, I put some clay in the valve pockets. And then we're going to bolt the front head down and torque it, as well as the rear head, and torque it. Then we're going to get the rocker arms and push rods installed so we can spin the motor over, so we get the valves make a pretty good indentation in the clay. And then we take our razor blade, cut that clay in half, and measure it with our calipers. I set it here for 80 thousandths, that's the minimum. Ended up having about 160 on the intakes and about 200 thousandths on the exhaust, so we're good to go. We begin final assembly by lubing up the head bolts with ARP's Ultra Torque Lube, installing our head gaskets, making sure orientation is correct. The rear cylinder goes on with a couple bolts just to hold it in place. Then we put the front cylinder on, screw a couple bolts in just to hold it in place. Now these schematic gaskets require a specific torque sequence, so they're lightly installed hand tight, and then following the instructions in the correct order. And then they get torqued to 14 foot-pounds. And then 30 foot-pounds in sequence. And then we have to back them off one full rotation. So loosen them up and then get our final torque in. So it's 14 and 27, I believe. And then we got to take our big breaker bar with a torque angle gauge and put 90 degrees on the bolt in sequence. And it's kind of hard. Perfect. Next step is to get our ported Ward's Performance manifold on with our Screaming Eagle 64mm throttle body. I find it's easier to do it now before the rocker arms go on the rocker boxes, so I can get to these bolts much easier. Next, our fueling rocker studs get installed. And we double nut them and tighten the nuts down to lock them together so we can get our 5 foot-pounds of torque on the stud. And then remove them. For this lower rocker cover, I only use a Harley gasket there, a Harley rubber seal. I find those have a tendency not to leak. I've had some bad experiences with the Cometics there. And then I like to torque these in two steps. 10 foot-pounds being the final. First one just to like 5 foot-pounds or so. And then lube up the roller rocker, the brand new roller rockers that are going in this from S&S. I mean, you see here I like to fill them up with oil so they come out the oil squirter holes, and then assembly lube on the rollers. Then the studs get red Loctite, just a drop. You don't want to go crazy here. You don't want to smash it out. And then you torque these in 2 steps, for the final being 25 foot-pounds. And then our breathers go in with brand new O-rings. Torque the bolts to 10 foot-pounds with blue Loctite on the threads. Then spin the motor over with your finger on the intake lifter. You're going to feel it move up and then down, and once it goes down, we are at top dead center, or pretty close to it, where we can install our adjustable push rods. First step is make sure you get your O-rings in, do the lifter blocks, and then the O-rings that go in the head, and then the push rod tube O-rings go on. Assembly lube on the ends of the push rods, and we stick it in. We're going to do the intake first, and we expand our quickie push rods, or S&S quickie push rods, until they don't move up and down anymore, and this is called zero lash. And then we hold the outer push rod with our 7/16 nut, and we have to turn these from zero lash 4 complete turns. So the inner push rod has four flats on it, so it's 16 flats. Now we lock the jam nut down with our scissor move here, and then we have to wait to spin the motor over until these push rods will spin, and that means the lifters have bled down enough to where they're at their resting location. And then we move the inner push rod tube up into the head, and then use a screwdriver as kind of a lever to push the collar down, the spring-loaded collar, and simultaneously push in the upper cover on and lock it down. Next we got our metal rocker cover gaskets, and torque all these bolts down to 10 foot-pounds in sequence with blue Loctite. Then clean up this masterpiece here, wipe off your fingerprints. Now it's time to install this motor. So lift it up. I have a jack underneath it with a wooden block. So I clear the frame, set it on the block carefully. And then it's just a matter of shimmying it into position and raising and lowering it depending on what it needs to get it to line up with the transmission. And now I added a second jack to the transmission so I can raise and lower that independent of the motor. And you just got to watch the lower mounts have dowels that slide into the motor, and before you bring the motor up, you want to make sure you have the gasket in place between the transmission and the motor, otherwise you'll have a nasty leak there. And there it goes into place. Now these bolts get blue Loctite and torqued down to 25 foot-pounds, and we are ready to get the primary and the exhaust on and hear this thing fire for the first time. See what this thing sounds like first startup. Hey, thanks for watching me assemble and install this 143 cubic inch Milwaukee 8 engine here. If you like the video, go ahead and like the video and comment and subscribe. And I will see you on the next one. Thank you.